Hey, good morning, everybody. My name's John, and I'm one of the pastors of H2O Church. Welcome to part three of our Journey to the Cross, which is meant to be a five-part Facebook Live event. When we're doing this because of COVID-19, not being able to gather together on Easter, we thought we'd do something a little different. For those of you that may be joining us that aren't part of H2O, I just wanted to take a second and mention our new rhythm. We have Mental Health Monday. Steve Reed gives a talk about how to have mental health during these highly stressful times. And then we do Theology Tuesday, Bible study on Thursday, and Friday we talk about a practice of living as a follower of Jesus. So thanks for joining us here today, and I'm excited about today's talk. What we've covered so far, we've looked at the Last Supper and then the Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And in this episode, we're going to look at the trials of Jesus, the trials. And there were six of them, actually. And this, to me, is fascinating. So one piece of information I want to give you before we jump in, just like when we have a president replaced by a new president, that that former president is still referred to as the high priest. And there's two high priests that are going to come into the action here, Caiaphas and Annas. Caiaphas is the current high priest, and Annas is the former high priest. So here's where we left off. Jesus is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, and all of the disciples run. It's interesting how crisis reveals you. And all of them run except John and Peter follow Jesus and the soldiers, now at a distance. And the first trial is before Annas. And this is really interesting to me. I didn't notice this until recently. John 18:16. So if you're the note-taking type of person, I write that down. Says this: Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. John is always so cryptic in describing himself. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest, but Peter stood outside the door. And we're like, what? How is this happening? So we don't have an answer to this, but somehow John, the son of Zebedee, who is a successful fisherman, was known to the high priest. And so we have access to this private conversation. Maybe John, earlier, when he was still a fisherman, delivered fish to the high priest. We don't know, but he had access. And so we get insider information here. And so Annas questions Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. And Jesus says this: I've spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I've said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me and what I said to them. They know what I said. And then one of the soldiers hits Jesus in the face. I'm not sure, but I think that might be a break in protocol. And Jesus responds with such patience after being struck in the face, which was about the biggest offense that you could do to a Jew. It was highly offensive. And Jesus says, if I told you the truth, why did you strike me? And it's so simple and so small we might miss this. But one of the things we're going to notice as we journey to the cross is the incredible and subtle expressions of love all along the way. And this is the first one. He doesn't go off. He doesn't defend himself. He just speaks truth gently. So there's actually several things that have been violated here, and I want to point those out to you. Jesus has been arraigned before any indictment has been brought against him. Annas tries to get Jesus to incriminate himself, and then he is struck. So that's phase one of the trial. Jesus is then taken to Caiaphas, who's the high priest at the time. Annas was the former high priest. And they begin another illegal trial. And this is probably after midnight. I actually thought of doing these Facebook Live events at the same time as they would have occurred in the life of Jesus until I realized that he basically pulled an all-nighter, and I thought twice. So that Sanhedrin violated almost every form of jurisprudence. Jesus was illegally tried without first having been charged with a crime. He was tried at night. The location of the trial was the high priest's home, not the temple. In other words, this is a private trial, not a public one. And there's no defense attorney. The Mosaic law allowed for a person to be convicted only on the testimony of two witnesses. And if you gave false witness, your punishment would be the same as the punishment for the criminal. And so in this case, people that gave false witness about Jesus should have been put to death, but there's no record of that. So finally, hours into the process, Caiaphas gets frustrated and he says, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah. And Jesus says, you say that I am. And I want to make a comment on this. This is not Jesus being slippery. This is not denying it. It's like saying, yes, you're speaking the truth, and it's coming out of your own mouth. You are held responsible for what you yourself are saying. Does that make sense? And then he continues on, but I tell you the truth, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. In case you're not familiar with that section, that's from the book of Daniel, where the Son of Man comes before the Ancient of Days and receives a kingdom. It is the strongest, clearest reference to Messiah, and the high priest knew it, and he tore his clothes, his robes. And then a vote is taken, and the decision is made to put him to death, and it's unanimous. And here's another little detail. Joseph of Arimathea, we know, was part of the Sanhedrin. It was a group of 70 men. Nicodemus was likely part of that too. There's no way that those two secret followers of Jesus voted for his death. And so behind the scenes, we know that they were either not invited to the trial or they were escorted out of the trial before the vote was even taken. Jesus is spat upon and struck and slapped with vehemence. There is a total breakdown of decorum and decency in these dignified men. And then the Gospel of Luke gives us another interesting detail. Luke 22, verse 63. Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking him, prophesy, who is it that struck you? And they said many other things against him, blaspheming him. So Jesus has gone through two trials at this point, and now he's being held in custody. And the very men that are holding him in custody give him a beating. Now, at the same time, Peter has denied knowing Jesus 3 times, and he hears the rooster crow, just like Jesus predicted would happen. And this is a little time clue. This is early morning, maybe 4 o'clock in the morning. It's likely the earliest time that a rooster would crow. And then we begin the third part of his trial, because the night trial was illegal. So the Sanhedrin, full of hypocrisy, needed to gather again as soon as the light of day hit. So shortly after the rooster crowed, maybe 4 o'clock, 4:30 in the morning, the Sanhedrin meets again to officially bind him and sentence him to death. Now, again, interesting fact, rabbinical law required that a sentence of death could only be carried out after 3 days. So what they would actually do is they would sentence someone and then they would fast for 3 days to make sure that they did not call the innocent guilty. Instead, the Sanhedrin immediately hands Jesus over to the Romans. Again, whether or not it was at the same time, there's something interesting here about Judas. Judas had gone to the temple to take the 30 pieces of silver that he was paid for his betrayal, and he wanted to give the money back because he had shed innocent blood. And strangely, the priest refused it, which is ironic because they had no problem taking the money out of the temple treasury to betray Jesus, but their conscience bothered them and they had difficulty putting the money back into the treasury. And so Judas throws the silver into the temple to force the chief priests, who didn't even want to touch the money, to have to pick it up. A little ploy on his part. It's an interesting verse in Zechariah 11:13. And the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the handsome price at which they valued me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them to the potter at the house of the Lord. The New Testament looks back at Zechariah and says that that prophecy was fulfilled by Judas. And what's interesting is that they took the money and they bought a field called the potter's field. So this is not prophecy in the sense that it fulfilled it, in the sense that it fulfilled a precise prophecy, like A is going to happen and then A happened. But it fulfilled it in the sense that it filled it full. In other words, if you're tracking with me, the Old Testament is full of little pictures, little images of the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, as if God wants to give us clues all along the way. So we enter now into the first Roman phase. And John notes that the chief priests were not willing to enter Pilate's palace because they would have been ritually defiled, which, again, irony. They didn't want to become ritually unclean, but they're putting the Messiah to death. So Pilate had to come out to him. Again, a little detail here. Because he had to come out to them, we have access to the conversation that occurred between Pilate and the Jews. So a little background on Pilate that you probably don't know, that Pilate had already made several bad decisions and was actually in hot water with Rome. And because of that, the Jews were able to use that leverage against him and to force him to do what they wanted him to do. Pilate goes inside with Jesus alone to get away from the chief priests. Then Pilate said to Jesus, so you're a king? Jesus answered, you say that I'm a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I've come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. Pilate said to him, what is truth? After he said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, I find no guilt in him. Matthew 27:14 says that Pilate was actually amazed by Jesus. But then someone says something. It's just fascinating, the little details that we'll find in the story. They said, he stirs up people throughout all Judea and Galilee. This is significant because if Jesus was Galilean, then Pilate could send him to Herod. And that's what leads us to the next part of the trial. So Jesus has stood before Annas, Caiaphas. He's been slapped by the Sanhedrin, beaten by temple guards, accused by Pilate, and now sent to Herod. Herod was happy to see Jesus because he wanted to see him perform a miracle. But in fulfillment of Isaiah 53, verse 7, that says a sheep is silent before its shearers, and Jesus doesn't respond at all. What's interesting to me here is that we have, again, insider information. The head of Herod's household was a man named Chuza. And his wife, according to Luke chapter 8, verses 2 and 3, a woman named Joanna, had become a believer and was actually following Jesus and providing for him and his disciples financially. So again, we get all this insider information. Herod can't get Jesus to say anything, and so he puts a royal robe on him to mock him and sent him back to Pilate. Pilate and Herod actually had enmity toward each other, but the gospel says Pilate and Herod became friends that day. So Pilate is running out of options. There's a custom that says that he can release one prisoner due to Passover, and he offers Barabbas, but things are spinning out of control at this point. Pilate is in the middle of the trial and is sitting on the judgment seat. And when you're sitting on the judgment seat, this is not the time to be interrupted by your wife. But Pilate's wife sends him a warning, saying that she suffered greatly in a dream because of that righteous man, Matthew 27:19. But Pilate is losing control of the situation. The crowd begins to chant, "Crucify him, crucify him. His blood be on us and our children." And so Pilate is going to scourge Jesus. What he's hoping for is to present back to the crowd a totally messed up Jesus in hopes that the crowd will give mercy. That's where we're going to pick up at 9 o'clock with the scourging of Jesus, and things are going to get intense. But before we sign off, I just want to encourage you to hit the share button and to pass this on to your friends so that they can join us too. So I'll see you back here at 9 o'clock.